I'm Claire Mitchell, 32 years old, and that Christmas Eve changed everything. The grand opening of my bakery, Sweet Haven, in Brooklyn, drew lines of customers around the block, with people raving, "This is the best cinnamon roll I've ever had in New York." But the front row reserved for family, completely empty. I stood surrounded by customers' laughter and the warm scent of cinnamon floating through the air, yet my eyes remained fixed on that empty chair with the handwritten sign, "Reserved for the Mitchell family." No apologetic text, no explanatory call, just the cruel silence of those who should have been proudest of me. That night, as I locked the bakery doors with vanilla still lingering in the air, I understood. They hadn't forgotten. They had chosen this. That's when I swore I would never again beg for recognition from them. Have you ever had your own family turn your dreams into a joke? Stay with me, because the revenge plan I executed will leave you stunned. The Mitchell family had always been a study in contrasts, and I had always been the odd one out. My younger sister Emily was the golden child, a Yale medical student with a Wall Street lawyer fiancé who looked like he stepped out of a Brooks Brothers catalog. My older brother Ryan was the entrepreneurial darling, running a tech startup in San Francisco that had just secured its second round of funding. And then there was me, Claire, forever labeled as the impractical dreamer who had somehow lost her way. But that label wasn't fair, and deep down, I knew it never had been. I had sacrificed more for this family than either of my siblings ever would. When Ryan needed startup capital, I had cashed out my 401k to help him. When Emily's medical school loans became overwhelming, I had taken on extra shifts at the restaurant where I worked, sending her money every month without being asked. When our grandmother Eleanor needed round-the-clock care in her final months, I had been the one to move in with her, sleeping on a pull-out couch and managing her medications while my siblings sent flowers and made brief, uncomfortable visits. Through all of this, I had been steadily building toward my own dream. Every spare dollar from my job as a pastry chef at Le Bernardin went into a savings account marked Sweet Haven. I studied at the Culinary Institute of America on nights and weekends, perfecting recipes that had been passed down from my grandmother. I spent months scouting locations in Brooklyn, negotiating with landlords, designing the layout that would transform a former flower shop into something magical. My family's reaction to these efforts ranged from dismissive to actively hostile. When I showed my father the business plan I had spent 6 months perfecting, he had glanced at it for maybe 30 seconds before pushing it back across his mahogany desk. "Claire, honey, this is a nice hobby, but you can't build a life on cupcakes. When are you going to get serious about your future?" My mother's approach was more subtle, but equally devastating. She would smile sweetly and ask about my little baking project in front of her friends, using the tone one might use to discuss a child's lemonade stand. When I landed a feature in Brooklyn Magazine about up-and-coming pastry chefs, she had somehow managed to avoid mentioning it to anyone in our extended family, despite sharing every minor achievement of Ryan's and Emily's on social media. The worst part was how they had systematically excluded me from the family narrative. At Ryan's engagement party the previous spring, his future mother-in-law had asked what I did for work. Before I could answer, my mother had jumped in with, "Oh, Claire's still figuring things out. She's been helping in restaurants while she decides on her next step." As if my years of professional experience and culinary training were just killing time between real careers. Emily's approach was perhaps the most cutting because it came wrapped in false concern. "I just worry about you, Claire," she had said during our last family dinner. "You're 32, and you're still chasing these dreams. Don't you think it's time to consider something more stable? Something that could actually support a family someday?" The implication was clear. My dreams were selfish indulgences that real adults should abandon, but I had persisted, fueled by something stronger than their disapproval. The memory of my grandmother Eleanor's hands teaching mine to fold dough, her voice telling me stories of the bakery she had run in Boston before the war. Baking is love made visible, she used to say. Don't let anyone convince you that love isn't worth pursuing. The day I signed the lease for Sweet Haven, I had called each family member with trembling excitement. Ryan had been on a conference call and asked if he could call me back. He never did. Emily had listened politely before launching into a story about her latest medical school rotation. My parents had exchanged one of their looks, the kind that spoke volumes about their shared disappointment in me. I had foolishly believed that the grand opening would be different. I had sent formal invitations on beautiful cardstock, had called personally to confirm their attendance, had even arranged the seating so they would have the best view of the kitchen where I would be working my magic. I had imagined their faces when they saw the lines of customers, tasted the pastries that food critics were already calling transcendent, witnessed firsthand that their impractical dreamer had built something real and beautiful and successful. Instead, I stood behind my counter on opening day, watching strangers become instant devotees of my grandmother's recipes, while the chairs labeled Mitchell Family remained mockingly empty. A food blogger from Time Out New York took photos of everything, interviewed customers who were already planning return visits, and asked if my family was proud of what I had accomplished. I had smiled and said they were, because admitting the truth would have been too humiliating. That evening, as I cleaned up from the most successful day of my professional life, I found myself staring at those empty chairs. The silence from my phone was deafening. No congratulations, no apologies, no acknowledgement that anything significant had happened. It was then that I realized this wasn't about being too busy or forgetting a date. This was about them hoping I would fail, hoping that reality would crush my dreams so thoroughly that I would finally surrender and become who they thought I should be. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to spend another day begging for crumbs of approval from people who saw my success as their embarrassment. I wasn't going to keep sacrificing my happiness for family members who viewed my dreams as inconvenient obstacles to their perfect narrative about who we were supposed to be. I was done being the family disappointment. It was time to show them exactly what they had chosen to dismiss. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but it began with a single decision. I would stop making myself smaller to accommodate their comfort. For years, I had been the family member who absorbed criticism without complaint, who provided financial support without recognition, who showed up to every event despite knowing I would be treated as an afterthought. That version of Claire Mitchell was gone forever. The first test came 2 weeks after opening, when my mother called with one of her signature requests disguised as invitations. Claire, darling, the hospital auxiliary is having their annual gala next month, and I was hoping you could cater the dessert table. It would be such a wonderful opportunity for you to meet the right people. The subtext was clear. She saw my bakery as a convenient source of free catering, not as a legitimate business worthy of respect. The old Claire would have said yes immediately, would have spent hundreds of dollars on ingredients and dozens of hours creating elaborate desserts, all while being introduced to her mother's friends as my daughter who makes little cakes. The new Claire had a different response. I'd be happy to provide catering services, I said calmly. My events package starts at $15 per person for a dessert table, with a minimum order of 50 people. I'll send you the contract and payment schedule. The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When my mother finally spoke, her voice had taken on the icy tone she reserved for service people who had disappointed her. Claire, this is for family. I wasn't expecting to pay commercial rates. Neither were the other clients who've hired me for their events, I replied. My work has value, whether it's for strangers or family. If you'd like to hire Sweet Haven for your gala, I'd be honored. If you're looking for free labor, you'll need to find someone else. She hung up without another word. Within hours, I received a group text from Ryan. Really, Claire? You're charging Mom now? What happened to family helping family? Emily's response was even more direct. I'm embarrassed by how selfish you've become, but I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I had drawn a boundary and held it, even when the pressure to cave had been enormous. More importantly, I had started to document everything. Every dismissed achievement, every financial contribution that went unacknowledged, every casual cruelty disguised as concern. I began keeping a record. The pattern became impossible to ignore once I started paying attention. When Brooklyn Magazine wanted to do a follow-up story about Sweet Haven's meteoric success, my mother mentioned casually at book club that she worried I was getting too big for my britches and might be in over my head. When I was invited to participate in a prestigious food festival in Manhattan, my father told his golf partners that he hoped I wouldn't embarrass the family by being too flashy. The sabotage was subtle, but persistent. Ryan had business connections throughout New York City, connections that could have meant significant catering contracts for Sweet Haven. Instead, he actively steered potential clients away from me, telling them he wasn't sure I was ready for that level of responsibility yet. When pressed by one of his friends who had specifically asked for my contact information, Ryan had said, "Trust me, you don't want the headache." Family businesses are always complicated. Emily's approach was to weaponize social media in ways that seemed supportive on the surface, but were designed to undermine my credibility. She would post photos of pastries from high-end Manhattan bakeries with captions like, "Treating myself to real French pastries today. Worth it? Setting the bar." When friends commented asking if she had tried her sister's bakery, she would respond with variations of, "Oh, Claire's stuff is cute, very homey." But it was the Easter incident that finally showed me just how orchestrated their campaign against me had become. Emily's engagement party was being held at our parents' house in Westchester, a lavish affair with a guest list that read like a who's who of New York's social and professional elite. I had assumed I would be invited as family, perhaps even asked to contribute my skills to make the event more memorable. Instead, I received a call from my mother 3 days before the party. "Claire, we've had a little mishap with the caterer. The dessert portion fell through at the last minute, and I was hoping you could save us. Nothing too elaborate, just some simple pastries for about 75 people. We'll credit you, of course." The request was insulting on multiple levels. Not only was I being asked to provide last-minute catering, which any professional would charge a premium for, but I was being offered credit instead of payment for what would amount to hundreds of dollars worth of ingredients and labor. More significantly, I was being positioned as the help rather than as a guest at my own sister's engagement party. But this time, I had a plan. "Of course I can help," I told my mother, my voice warm with false enthusiasm. "I'll create something absolutely spectacular for Emily's special day." What I didn't tell her was that this would be the event that finally revealed to our extended family and social circle exactly who my parents and siblings really were. I spent the next 3 days crafting what would become my masterpiece of passive-aggressive artistry. The dessert table was indeed spectacular, a towering display of architectural pastries that had guests pulling out their phones to take photos. French macarons and Emily's wedding colors formed intricate patterns, while handcrafted chocolate sculptures created a centerpiece that belonged in a museum. Every element was perfect, professional, and completely Instagram-worthy. But I had also done something else. Nestled among the elegant display cards labeling each dessert were small, beautifully calligraphed signs that told a different story. Complimentary desserts provided by Sweet Haven Bakery, Brooklyn's premier destination for artisanal pastries. Each sign included my business information and a QR code linking to my website. More importantly, I had stationed myself at the dessert table, not as a family member enjoying the party, but as the professional caterer I had been asked to be. I wore my Sweet Haven apron and chef's jacket, introduced myself to guests as the bakery owner, and handed out business cards to everyone who complimented the desserts. The transformation was remarkable. Suddenly, guests who had known me as the Mitchell daughter who never quite found her way were seeing me as a successful entrepreneur whose work rivaled anything they had experienced at New York's finest establishments. I watched my parents' faces as their friends raved about my pastries, asked for my card, and made bookings for their own events. When Mrs. Whitman, the wife of my father's biggest client, asked if I was the same Claire Mitchell who had been featured in Food and Wine magazine, my mother's smile became strained. When Judge Harrison's wife booked me on the spot for her daughter's bridal shower, offering to pay double my usual rate for priority service, my father's jaw visibly tightened. But the real moment of revelation came when Emily, radiant in her engagement dress, approached the dessert table with her fiancé and future in-laws. She had been holding court all evening, accepting congratulations and basking in the attention, but she hadn't once acknowledged that her sister had created the dessert display that guests were calling museum quality. "These pastries are absolutely divine," gushed her future mother-in-law, a prominent socialite whose approval Emily had been desperately seeking. "Where on earth did you find such a talented pastry chef?" Emily's face went through several expressions before settling on tight-lipped irritation. She glanced at me, standing professionally behind my display, then back at the woman whose opinion could make or break her social standing. "Oh," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "That's my sister. She makes little cakes." The dismissal was so casual, so practiced, that it took the woman a moment to process what she had heard. When she did, her expression shifted from confusion to barely concealed shock. "Your sister created all of this?" she asked, gesturing to the elaborate display. "And you've never mentioned having such a talented family member?" I watched Emily struggle for an answer, watched my parents exchange panicked glances, watched Ryan attempt to change the subject by loudly calling for a toast. But the damage was done. In trying to diminish my achievement, Emily had revealed something ugly about herself to exactly the kind of people whose opinions she valued most. That night, as I packed up my equipment and leftover pastries, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with truth. I had given my family exactly what they had asked for: professional catering services for their event. The fact that doing my job well had exposed their years of casual cruelty wasn't my problem. The real victory came in the days that followed. My phone rang constantly with booking requests from people who had attended the party. My website traffic tripled. Most importantly, I began receiving messages from other family members, aunts, uncles, and cousins, who had been told I was struggling to find my way, but had now seen evidence of my success with their own eyes. It was my great-aunt Margaret who finally asked the question that would change everything. "Claire, dear, why didn't anyone tell me you had become such a successful businesswoman? I've been worried about you for years, thinking you were still trying to figure out your life." That's when I realized the full scope of what my immediate family had been doing. They hadn't just been dismissing my achievements. They had been actively spreading a narrative about me that painted me as a failure, ensuring that even extended family members who might have been supportive were kept in the dark about my actual life and success. The documentation I had been keeping suddenly took on new significance. This wasn't just about hurt feelings or family dynamics. This was about a systematic campaign to isolate me and undermine my business. It was time to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. But I would need allies, and I knew exactly where to find them. The war I was about to wage wouldn't be fought with screaming matches or dramatic confrontations. It would be won through the quiet, devastating power of truth, strategically revealed at precisely the right moments to exactly the right people. My family had spent years controlling the narrative about who I was and what I was worth. It was time to take that control back. My first ally came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Eleanor Whitman, the socialite who had witnessed Emily's dismissive comment at the engagement party, called me personally 3 days later. "My dear," she said in her crisp Upper East Side accent, I've been thinking about what happened at your sister's party, and I find myself quite disturbed. Would you be available for lunch? I believe we have much to discuss." Over salmon and champagne at the plaza, Mrs. Whitman revealed something that stopped my heart. "I've known your mother for 15 years through the hospital auxiliary," she said, delicately cutting her fish. "And in all that time, she has never once mentioned having a daughter in the culinary arts. In fact, when asked about her children, she typically speaks of having 2 successful children and one who is still finding her way." The betrayal was even deeper than I had imagined. Not only were they dismissing my achievements within our immediate circle, but my mother had been actively erasing me from her social identity, reducing me to a source of embarrassment to be hidden from her peers. Mrs. Whitman leaned forward, her eyes sharp with the kind of social intelligence that had made her a power player in Manhattan's elite circles. "What your family has done is unconscionable, and more importantly for them, it's socially damaging. Word is already spreading about Emily's behavior at her own engagement party, dismissing her sister's obviously professional work as little cakes while standing in front of what was clearly museum-quality artistry. People are beginning to ask questions about what kind of family treats their own members with such casual cruelty. This was the opening I needed. "Mrs. Whitman," I said carefully, "would you be interested in hearing the full story?" Over the next 2 hours, I laid out everything. The years of financial support that had gone unacknowledged, the systematic dismissal of my professional achievements, the way my family had deliberately excluded me from their social narrative while simultaneously expecting me to provide unpaid labor for their events. Mrs. Whitman listened with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly how damaging this information could be in the right hands. "My dear girl," she said finally, "you've been playing by their rules for far too long. It's time you learned to play by mine." What followed was a masterclass in social warfare. Mrs. Whitman had connections that extended far beyond my parents' circle, and she began using them with surgical precision. She started small, mentioning to mutual friends how impressed she had been with the Mitchell girls' pastry work, how surprised she was that such talent had been kept so quiet within the family. These conversations always included just enough detail about the engagement party incident to plant seeds of curiosity and concern. Meanwhile, I was building my own campaign. The documentation I had been keeping became the foundation for a comprehensive social media strategy that would reframe the entire narrative about my relationship with my family. But I didn't start with dramatic revelations or angry accusations. Instead, I began telling my own story with quiet dignity and professional pride. My Instagram account, which had been focused solely on bakery content, began including personal elements that revealed the truth about my background. A photo of my culinary school diploma, with a caption about working nights and weekends to pursue my dream while supporting my family through difficult times. A throwback picture of myself with our grandmother Eleanor, sharing the story of how she had inspired my career and left me her recipe collection. Recipes that had become the foundation of Sweet Haven's success. The response was overwhelming. Customers who had known me as simply the talented baker from Brooklyn began to understand that I was also someone who had overcome significant family obstacles to build my business. Food bloggers picked up the story, framing it as an inspirational tale of entrepreneurial success despite lack of family support. But the real turning point came when I decided to document the financial reality of my relationship with my siblings. Using bank records and payment confirmations I had carefully preserved, I created a detailed accounting of every dollar I had contributed to my family over the years. The numbers were staggering, over $75,000 in direct financial support to Ryan's business ventures, Emily's education, and family emergencies, none of which had ever been acknowledged or repaid. I didn't publish this information immediately. Instead, I shared it with Mrs. Whitman and asked for her advice on how to proceed. Her response was swift and brutal. "This changes everything. Your parents have been portraying you as the family failure while you were actually the family bank. When this becomes public knowledge, and it will, Their social standing will be irreparably damaged. The opportunity to reveal everything came sooner than expected. Emily's wedding was scheduled for September, and the guest list included everyone who mattered in my parents' social and professional circles. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I received the call I had been expecting. Claire? My mother's voice was strained, artificially sweet. I have wonderful news. We've decided to make Emily's wedding a real family affair, and we'd love for Sweet Haven to handle all the desserts. It would mean so much to have your contribution be part of Emily's special day. The irony was perfect. After months of dismissing my work as little cakes and excluding me from family celebrations, they now wanted my professional services for their most important social event. The old Claire would have been thrilled by this apparent recognition, would have worked for weeks to create something spectacular as a gesture of love and forgiveness. The new Claire had different plans. I'd be honored to cater Emily's wedding, I said warmly. Let me send you my premium wedding package information. Given the timeline and the scale of the event, we'll need to discuss rush charges and deposit requirements. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my mother's breathing. Deposit requirements? She finally managed. Claire, this is Emily's wedding. This is family. Exactly, I replied, which is why I want to make sure everything is perfect and professional. My wedding package includes a detailed contract that protects everyone involved and ensures the highest level of service. I'll email everything over today. The contract I sent was a work of art. 12 pages of detailed specifications, payment schedules, and cancellation policies that would make any commercial client weep with admiration for its thoroughness. But buried within the professional language were clauses that would give me complete control over how my contribution was acknowledged and presented. Most importantly, the contract required full payment in advance, $8,500 for the dessert service they were requesting. For a family that had spent years treating my professional work as something I should provide for free, the price tag was a shock to their system. Ryan called within hours, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. $8,000? Are you out of your mind? This is Emily's wedding, not some corporate event. You're absolutely right, I agreed pleasantly. This is much more important than a corporate event. That's why I'm offering my premium service level, the same package I provide for clients whose events get featured in Vogue and Town and Country. Emily deserves nothing less than perfection for her special day. The family meeting that followed was everything I had hoped for and more. Gathered in my parents' living room, the same room where I had been lectured countless times about my unrealistic dreams, my family attempted to stage what they clearly thought would be a successful intervention. Claire, we're concerned about you, my father began, using his most authoritative boardroom voice. This behavior isn't like you. Charging family for services, making demands, creating drama around Emily's wedding. It's not the daughter we raised. You're right, I said calmly. The daughter you raised would have said yes immediately, would have spent thousands of dollars and dozens of hours creating something beautiful, and would have been happy to be acknowledged with a single line in the program crediting family contributions. That daughter spent years providing financial and emotional support without recognition, attending events where she was treated as help rather than family, and watching her achievements be dismissed as hobbies while she funded her siblings' actual dreams. Emily's face was flushed with indignation. I can't believe how selfish you've become. This is supposed to be my special day, and you're trying to make it about money. It was always about money, Emily, I replied. When I cashed out my retirement account to help pay for your medical school loans, that was about money. When I worked double shifts to send you spending money during your rotations, that was about money. When I paid for Ryan's startup costs and your engagement party catering, that was about money. The only difference is that now I'm asking to be paid instead of paying others. The room fell silent except for the ticking of the grandfather clock that had witnessed so many family gatherings over the years. My parents exchanged the same look they had been sharing about me for decades. the expression of people dealing with a problem child who refused to understand her place. But this time, I had backup. As if summoned by divine timing, the doorbell rang. My mother went to answer it, returning moments later with a confused expression, and Mrs. Whitman following close behind. "I do apologize for the intrusion," Mrs. Whitman said, with the serene confidence of someone accustomed to being welcome everywhere. "I was in the neighborhood and wanted to speak with Claire about a catering opportunity. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The transformation in my parents' demeanor was immediate and complete. They had spent years cultivating their friendship with Mrs. Whitman, viewing her as a gateway to Manhattan's elite social circles. Her opinion could make or break their standing in the community that mattered most to them. "Mrs. Whitman, how lovely to see you," my mother gushed, her earlier irritation replaced by nervous hospitality. "Please join us. We were just having a family discussion about Claire's business." "How wonderful," Mrs. Whitman replied, settling into the chair my father hastily offered. "I've been absolutely fascinated by Claire's success story. Building such an acclaimed bakery while simultaneously supporting her family through various challenges. It's quite remarkable." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. My parents' faces went through several expressions as they processed what Mrs. Whitman had just said. She clearly knew more about my situation than they had expected, and her tone suggested admiration rather than the dismissive pity they had been counting on from their social circle. "You know," Mrs. Whitman continued conversationally, "I was just telling my friend Judge Morrison about Claire's situation. She was absolutely appalled when I mentioned how Emily had dismissed her sister's obviously professional work as little cakes at the engagement party. The judge said it reminded her of a case she once heard involving family members who systematically undermined a successful relative's business interests." The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Judge Morrison was the wife of a federal judge and one of the most respected figures in my parents' social circle. Her disapproval could end careers and exile families from the society they had spent decades trying to penetrate. Emily's face had gone pale. "I think there's been some misunderstanding. I never meant to dismiss Claire's work. I was just surprised by how elaborate everything was." "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Whitman replied with lethal sweetness, "there's no misunderstanding at all. Several people heard the exchange quite clearly, but I'm sure you meant well. Family dynamics can be so complex, especially when there are such obvious disparities in how different achievements are valued and acknowledged." Ryan attempted to salvage the situation with his practiced corporate charm. "Mrs. Whitman, I think you might have gotten the wrong impression about our family. We're all incredibly proud of Claire's success. We've just been concerned about the financial aspects of mixing business with family relationships." "Have you?" Mrs. Whitman's eyebrows rose in polite surprise. "How interesting, because I've been under the impression that Claire has been the one providing financial support to family members for years. In fact, I believe the figure is quite substantial, somewhere in the range of $75,000 over the past 5 years alone." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. My parents stared at me with expressions I had never seen before, a mixture of shock, betrayal, and dawning horror, as they realized that their carefully constructed narrative about our family had been completely exposed. "Claire," my father said slowly, "you've been discussing our private family finances with outsiders." "I've been documenting the reality of my contributions to this family," I replied calmly. "The same contributions that have been systematically ignored and dismissed while you've portrayed me to your friends as the family failure." Mrs. Whitman asked me to explain why I was being treated as hired help at my own sister's engagement party, and I told her the truth. Mrs. Whitman stood gracefully, her purpose accomplished. "I should leave you all to your discussion. Claire, do give me a call about that catering opportunity. The Philanthropic Women's Council is planning quite an elaborate event, and after seeing your work, I know you'd be perfect for it." After she left, the room remained silent for long minutes. My family seemed to be collectively processing the magnitude of what had just happened. Their social reputation, which they had spent decades carefully cultivating, had been dealt a potentially fatal blow by someone whose opinion mattered more than almost anyone else's in their circle. "You've destroyed us," Emily whispered finally, tears beginning to flow down her cheeks. "Do you understand what you've done? Mrs. Whitman will tell everyone. Our reputation, our social standing, everything we've worked for." "Everything you've worked for," I corrected gently. "I've been working for something entirely different. I've been trying to build a business, support my family, and earn the respect and recognition that should come naturally from the people who claim to love me. What I've discovered is that you only value what I can provide, not who I am." My mother's mask had finally slipped completely. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? By humiliating us in front of our friends? What have you done for me?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Please, tell me specifically what you've done to support my dreams, acknowledge my achievements, or treat me as an equal member of this family. Because I have detailed records of what I've done for all of you, and I'm beginning to think this relationship has been entirely one-sided." The contract for Emily's wedding remained unsigned. 3 days later, I received a terse email from my father informing me that my services would no longer be required and that I should consider our business relationship terminated. The tone suggested that he thought he was punishing me. Instead, he had given me the greatest gift possible: complete freedom from their expectations and demands. The wedding proceeded without Sweet Haven's contribution, with desserts provided by a generic commercial catering service that charged twice what I would have and delivered a fraction of the quality. But by then, it didn't matter. The story of the Mitchell family's treatment of their successful daughter had spread through their social circle like wildfire, aided by Mrs. Whitman's strategic conversations and corroborated by the dozens of witnesses who had seen Emily's dismissive behavior firsthand. The social consequences were swift and devastating. Invitations to exclusive events dried up. Business relationships that had taken years to build suddenly became strained as people questioned the character of individuals who would systematically undermine and financially exploit their own family member. Ryan's startup found itself struggling to secure its next round of funding when potential investors began asking uncomfortable questions about his business ethics. But the most beautiful revenge was the success that followed. Mrs. Whitman's recommendation opened doors to a level of clientele I had only dreamed of reaching. Within 6 months, Sweet Haven had expanded to include a second location in Manhattan's Upper East Side. Food and Wine featured me on their cover as the baker who built an empire despite the odds. Most importantly, I had built a chosen family of friends, colleagues, and supporters who valued me for exactly who I was. The final confrontation came almost a year later, when my parents arrived unannounced at the Manhattan location. They looked older, diminished somehow, as if the weight of their social exile had physically aged them. My mother's perfectly styled exterior couldn't hide the desperation in her eyes as she approached the counter where I was working. "Claire," she began, her voice carefully modulated, "we've come to apologize. We realize we made mistakes, and we want to make things right between us." I looked at them, really looked at them, for the first time in months. They weren't here because they had experienced some profound realization about how badly they had treated me. They were here because the social and financial consequences of their behavior had finally become unbearable, and they needed me to publicly forgive them to restore their standing in the community. "I appreciate the apology," I said quietly, "but I'm not interested in making things right. I'm interested in building something better. I've learned that family isn't about shared DNA or childhood memories. It's about people who show up for each other, who celebrate each other's successes, and who provide support during difficult times. You've shown me repeatedly that you're not that kind of family." My father's face flushed with the angry red color I remembered from childhood confrontations. "You can't seriously mean to cut us off permanently. We're your parents, Claire. We raised you. You raised me to believe I wasn't good enough," I replied. "You raised me to accept crumbs of attention while providing feast after feast of support to others. You raised me to apologize for my dreams and dim my light so you could feel comfortable. That version of me is gone forever." As they left, empty-handed and defeated, I felt something I had never experienced before in relation to my family: genuine peace. I had spent 32 years trying to earn their love and respect, not understanding that it was never available to be earned. Their approval came with conditions that required me to diminish myself, and I was no longer willing to pay that price. 6 months later, I received a wedding invitation in the mail. Emily was getting married again, this time to a different man, in a much smaller ceremony that reflected their reduced social circumstances. There was a handwritten note attached. "Claire, I know we can't undo the past, but I hope you'll consider being part of our future. Your sister, Emily." I sent a beautiful arrangement of flowers with a card that read, "Wishing you happiness in your new beginning. Claire Mitchell, Sweet Haven Bakery." It was professional, appropriate, and completely devoid of the emotional investment they had come to expect from me. The flowers were my final gift to the family I had been born into, and my first gift to the family I had chosen to create. That evening, I celebrated with my chosen family: Mrs. Whitman, my business partner Sarah, my head baker Marcus, and a dozen other people who had supported my dreams without demanding I sacrifice my dignity in return. We raised glasses of champagne in the bakery that had started as my impossible dream and had become my beautiful reality. The space smelled like vanilla and possibility, filled with the laughter of people who chose to love me for exactly who I was. That's when I finally understood what my grandmother Eleanor had meant all those years ago. Love made visible isn't just about baking. It's about choosing people who see your worth and refusing to accept anything less than the respect you deserve. I had spent years being the family disappointment. Now I was the family success story they would never be able to claim credit for. And that, more than any dramatic confrontation or public humiliation, was the sweetest revenge of all. 2 years have passed since that Christmas Eve when I stood in my empty bakery, staring at chairs reserved for family members who chose not to come. Sweet Haven now has 4 locations across New York City, a cookbook deal with a major publisher, and a waiting list for catering services that stretches 6 months into the future. More importantly, I wake up every morning surrounded by people who value my contributions, celebrate my achievements, and show up when they say they will. The Mitchell family occasionally appears in my peripheral vision. A social media post here, a mutual acquaintances update there. They've managed to rebuild some semblance of their former social standing, though they'll never again occupy the position of unquestioned respectability they once held. Emily's second marriage seems happy, Ryan's startup eventually found investors, and my parents continue their charitable work with somewhat less fanfare than before. But here's what I want you to understand, because maybe you're sitting where I was, making yourself smaller to accommodate people who should be making space for your light. You don't owe anyone your dreams as payment for their love. Real family, whether born or chosen, celebrates your success without conditions, supports your goals without resentment, and shows up without being begged. I spent 32 years believing that if I just gave enough, sacrificed enough, diminished myself enough, I would finally earn the recognition and respect I craved from my family. What I learned is that people who require you to dim your light to make them comfortable will never be satisfied with any amount of dimming. There will always be one more sacrifice required, one more dream to abandon, one more piece of yourself to surrender. The day I stopped trying to earn their approval was the day I started building the life I actually wanted. The day I stopped accepting their definition of my worth was the day I discovered how valuable I really was to people who mattered. The day I chose my own family was the day I finally came home. If you've ever been the family member who gives everything and receives criticism, who achieves success only to have it dismissed as luck or accident, who shows up faithfully for people who can't be bothered to acknowledge your existence, this is your permission slip to stop. You don't have to keep playing a rigged game where you're destined to lose. Your dreams matter. Your achievements deserve recognition. Your contributions should be appreciated. And if the people who are supposed to love you most can't provide those basic forms of respect, it's time to find people who can. The sweetest revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public humiliation. It's building a beautiful life with people who choose to see your worth and refusing to accept anything less than the love and respect you deserve. It's showing up for yourself the way you've always shown up for others and discovering that you were never the problem. You were just trying to bloom in soil that was never meant to nurture your growth. Sometimes the most radical thing you can do is stop trying to fix a broken relationship and start building healthy ones instead. Sometimes the bravest choice is walking away from people who demand your light while offering nothing but shadows in return. I'm Claire Mitchell, and I chose myself. I chose my dreams. I chose a family that celebrates who I am instead of demanding I become someone else. And 2 years later, that choice has given me a life more beautiful than any I could have imagined while I was busy trying to earn approval from people who were never going to give it. If my story resonates with you, if you've ever been told your dreams don't matter by people whose opinions shouldn't matter, I want to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below. Tell me about the dreams you're chasing despite the doubters, the success you've built despite the saboteurs, the family you've chosen despite the DNA you were dealt. And if you're still in the stage where you're trying to earn recognition from people who refuse to give it, remember this. You are not required to set yourself on fire to keep other people warm. Your light is not too bright. Their vision is too dim. Your dreams are not too big. Their imagination is too small. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that chosen family trumps biological obligation, that success is the best revenge, and that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is stop trying to save people who are determined to drown. Because your story, whatever it is, deserves to be heard by people who will celebrate it instead of diminishing it. The recipe for my grandmother's cinnamon rolls is now available in stores across the country, shared with people who appreciate both the flavor and the love that goes into every batch. But the most important recipe she ever taught me wasn't for baking. It was for living. Choose people who choose you. Invest in relationships that invest back in you, and never apologize for taking up the space you are meant to fill in this world. That's the sweetest revenge of all. Not just surviving despite them, but thriving because of the strength you discovered when they forced you to stand alone. And once you taste that freedom, you'll never go back to begging for crumbs when you deserve the whole feast.